odyssey from communist red diaper baby to pro-freedom activist. George Gilder described this book as the first great autobiography of his generation. I had the privilege of seeing Mr. Horowitz in Boston on his 1997 book tour on the release of Radical Sun. And there were little protests around, but they're nothing like happens today. Mr. Horowitz has devoted much of his attention over the past several years to the radicalization of the American university. In 2003, he launched an academic freedom campaign to return the American university to traditional principles of open inquiry and to halt left-wing indoctrination in the classroom. To further these goals, he devised an academic Bill of Rights to protect students from abusive professors. In the same year, Mr. Horowitz founded Students for Academic Freedom, which now has chapters on over 200 college campuses. Mr. Horowitz has made news in the last 2 weeks, scheduled to speak on April 12 at his alma mater, the University of California at Berkeley. The university scheduled him a half-mile away from campus at a time when most classes were in session, and told the event's organizers that they must pay $5,700 for their own security detail. Under such pressures, the speech had to be canceled. Thus do we witness an Orwellian situation where free speech is now suppressed at Berkeley, which was the birthplace of the free speech movement. Mr. Horowitz, I'd like to welcome you today to a safe space on our campus. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Horowitz.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege for all you young people to go to a school like this. Jack Kennedy once said, "Life is unfair." And what he meant by this was that his older brother Joe was the star of the family. He was the famous Kennedy, he was the smartest Kennedy, and he was the Kennedy that the father, Joe Kennedy, was grooming to be president. But towards the end of the Second World War, in the last months of it, he volunteered for what turned out to be a suicide mission. A plane loaded with explosives that blew up in the plane on his way to the bombing site. I think that's one thing that we all learned by the time we're in high school. Life is unfair. Talents were not handed out equally. Some people are very pretty. Some people are tall. Some people who are small compensate for being small, like Napoleon, conquer the world or whatever. But talents just aren't handed out. Energy isn't handed out equally. And this translates, as you go through life, into other inequalities. If you're really good looking and charming, things come to you maybe too easily. Maybe you don't develop your brain power. If you're really smart, when you're 22 or 23 years old, like Mark Zuckerberg, you can become a billionaire from nothing. This is the reality that we live in. Now, our founding document says all men are created equal. And it meant to include men and women, because what it really meant was that we are all creatures of the same God, and we are all equal in his eyes. And therefore, government needs to treat us equally. That's what equality means. It doesn't mean that we're all equal. We're actually all very unequal. However, human beings are also born with a desire an arrogant desire, I would say, to remake the world, to make the world into a perfect place, to create what's now called social justice. If you think of your biblical precedents, think of Genesis. What did the serpent tell Adam and Eve? The serpent said, if you eat of that tree, of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall be as God. That was the seduction, and that was the pride that led to their fall. In the 5th century, there was a debate within Catholicism between two giant figures. One was St. Augustine, and the other was Pelagius. And the Pelagian heresy, as it came to be called, is the root of all radicalism. Augustine held to the doctrine of original sin, that we all have the sin of Adam within us, because that's the way we were created. We were created with free will and the freedom to do evil as well as to do good. Pelagius believed that you could institute that people could live by a holy law, that the world could be made a holy place by man's will alone, that human beings could create a heaven on earth. Behind every radical idea and every radical movement, including what we now call progressivism, is this idea that you can remake the world as though you were God. The Tower of Babel, the story of Babel, is the same story, building a tower that human beings can get back to heaven. If you'll recall, God put an angel with a flaming sword at the gates of Eden to prevent any return. The only way human beings can get to a state of perfect equality, social justice, whatever you want to call it, heaven, is by a divine intervention. How can you have social justice administered by human beings who are liars, corrupt, greedy, and all the 7 deadly sins? This is the struggle of our time. If you are a radical, you see the world as a fallen place, a place of oppression and injustice. And radicals see everything as oppression. If there's inequality, it must be because somebody is holding somebody else down, which isn't the case really at all. It's very selective. The left uses, for example, race as a weapon in its political battles. And we'll look at disparities. I mean, you've heard this 100 times. If a minority is not represented in accordance to its proportion in the population, that's an injustice. Is it? Is it? 90% of the starting multi-millionaires in the National Basketball Association are black. Is that because there's a black conspiracy to keep power Asian forwards from playing basketball? They're just different talents. There's a really good book by John Entine about sports. 49 out of the 50 fastest human beings on the planet are black. Every record holder in the marathon is not only from Kenya, but from one Kenyan tribe. It just wasn't distributed equally. And this country is built on the idea that we still can regard, the government needs to regard everybody equally. And let me, since I'm on this subject, slavery. America is held to be guilty for slavery. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But slavery existed for 3,000, and I learned this from a very famous African-American historian, Orlando Patterson, who is at Harvard's, the W.E.B. Du Bois Black Studies Department at Harvard, wrote a book on this. But 3,000 years, slavery has existed. And it's existed in all societies. And it was the normal practice when you conquered somebody in war, you enslaved them. You enslaved them. So that everybody in this room, if you go far back enough, is descended from slaves. And it wasn't until Wilberforce and a group of white male Protestants in England declared slavery immoral that the world began to change. And Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, wrote into the birth certificate of the United States the proposition that all men are created equal and are endowed not by government, but by their creator with inalienable rights to life and liberty. Within 20 years, the United States abolished the slave trade, and within a little over a generation, abolished slavery. And that led to the abolition of slavery throughout the Western Hemisphere. And the British even sent gunboats into Africa to liberate slaves. And there's still slavery in Africa and in the Muslim world. So the United States, you can look at either side of that coin. The United States did inherit a slave system. And if you think that it should have been overthrown in 1776, you have to think that Britain, we were colonies of the greatest empire in the world. We were little colonies. If slavery had been ended, if an attempt to end it, we would have had a civil war in the United States with the southern slave states, and they would have been allied with the British Empire. So contemplating that induced a caution in the founders. It's often distorted by the left, by radicals. They say, oh, the Constitution was just documented by slave owners, and they considered blacks subhuman, so they were only 3/5 of a person. Well, actually, if you look at the 3/5 compromise, you'll see that it's the slave states that wanted black Americans to be 5/5 of a whole person. Why? Because that would increase their congressional representation and their power. And it was the anti-slavery colonists, or Americans, who wanted a 3/5 compromise to reduce the power of the slave states. People on the left see things in black and white, in cartoonish ways. Everything is very extreme because they have this model that you're oppressed if you fall out, if you're not on the top. The top is oppressing everybody. We hear it every day. The 1% oppresses the 99%. Actually, the 1% is responsible for most of the funding of all the government programs that help people. The 1% is responsible for the jobs that people have so they can live a decent life. And the fact that Bill Gates says whatever it is, $100 million does not affect the fact that people in this room don't have 100 million or a billion or $100 billion or whatever he has. And that money isn't sitting in his pocket or buried in his mattress. It's working. It's working capital, creating jobs for other people. So the vision, let me do this another way. Oppression. If the heat is oppressive, does the heat ever get oppressive in Minnesota? If you say, oh, this heat is oppressive, what do? You go inside and turn on the air conditioning. You get out of the heat. Is there a big exodus from the United States? If America is an oppressive society and oppresses black people, why do all those Haitians want to come here and risk their lives? The answer is because even though Haiti has been an independent country since the 18th century, a black Haitian in America, despite the existence of bigots, there are always going to be bigots. There will always be racists. They're just like that. It's part of the human genome, hate. Despite that, despite the abuse of this or that Haitian, a black Haitian in America has more rights, more privileges, more opportunities than in black-run Haiti or in any black country in the world. And that's not because there are white people here. It's because of the American founding. It's because of the political system that the founders set up. It's because they were all refugees from real oppression, with religious oppression. They came from countries where the churches were established and punished religious sects that weren't part of the establishment. That's why. This is a great gift, America, an incredible gift, a gift to the world, but to everybody who's privileged to be here. Now we face the great crisis of our time is posed by radical Islam. And I wrote a book in 2004 called Unholy Alliance, Radical Islam and the American Left. And the Islamic view is close to that, or really parallel to that, of the secular radicals. Because the Islamists are Pelagians. They believe that they can make the world a holy place by killing all the infidels or forcing them to submit, that they can make the world run according to God's law. That's basically the radical view, although the radicals wouldn't put God into the mix, that you can create a heaven on earth by using state power, by force. That's what the Islamists believe. That's why they're crucifying Christians throughout the Middle East. To me, I don't want to get too political, but one of the great sins of Obama and the Obama administration is to have stood by, first to have created a vacuum in the Middle East by giving up our base in Iraq and withdrawing our troops that let ISIS expand, but also to sit idly by the greatest power on earth while Islamists slaughtered the Christian communities of Iraq and Syria. The Christian community in Iraq is the oldest Christian community on earth. The temple in Mosul had continuous sermons since the time of St. Paul until the Obama administration. And they were just slaughtered, wiped out. It's a religious genocide. And I don't know how our president could have done nothing, but he did nothing to stop it. We see this everywhere, this vision of perfect equality, of social justice, I mean, I think this last 2 years has been kind of illuminating. For me, it was shocking to find the FBI is so political. I mean, it shouldn't have been. But still, it causes a shock to the system. Whatever you think of Comey, whether you think he elected Trump or sabotaged or protected Hillary, either one. Why the heck is he doing that? I mean, this is supposed to be a law and order. He's our security, but he's totally political. So that, and I don't single out FBI Director Comey as a especially bad individual. I think he's probably typical of what goes on in Washington. So how can you expect out of the people who are in politics, how can you expect them to make the world a holy place, to create social justice, to treat people, without regard to their skin color or their, all the other characteristics, their gender, their sexual orientation, and so forth, their wealth? It's a miracle when justice takes place. One of the reasons I watch sports, there are a lot of pleasures in watching sports, is that sports is the only arena where sometimes there actually is justice. So this is a view of the world. This is the conservative view. Conservatives are always looking that things don't get worse than they are, because they understand that the bad, and of course conservatives are concerned with individual justice, but just looking at the world as a whole, or looking at the United States as society as a whole, conservatives expect things to be what they are, and don't look to transform everybody and make the world a fundamentally better place. It can't be a fundamentally better place. If you, I don't know if you read the Iliad yet, but if you read the Bible. Now, the people in the Bible was, I'm really poor on this, but it's got to have been written 3,500 years ago, something like that. Thousands of years ago. Do you recognize the people in the Bible? Of course you do. Otherwise you couldn't read it if they were like aliens. I mean, space aliens. You might read it for interest, but you wouldn't read it for guidance. So people haven't changed in thousands of years. So all the injustices you see in the Bible are here today. Sometimes you can eliminate some injustice. Slavery was a terrible injustice, but as I say, it was universal. But the United States can take great pride in having led the way worldwide in ending slavery. But the injustices that you see today were there 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And that's why we read the ancients for wisdom, because they had the same experience that we do. Now, that doesn't mean that life is not a challenge and one that you can get excited about. You can create justice in the space around you. You can do good. You can help individuals. And we all are inspired by stories of people who do this. And we all get moral satisfaction out of doing it ourselves. But we're not going to redeem the world. Only God can do that. Thank you. Now, I will take questions if anybody wants to ask a question.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
Hi, so your view seems to be that people can cause change in the world for the better, essentially. People can make social justice happen. But something that confuses me about that would be, one, why would you be opposed to people trying that if you don't think it'll happen?
Good question.
And two, how did the civil rights movement happen? How can you explain that as not social justice?
Oh, there's two very good questions. And I hope I can remember both of them by the time I get finished. The first is, what's wrong with wanting to make the world a perfect place? And the answer is this. Well, first of all, in my lifetime, 100 million people were slaughtered in peacetime by social justice warriors in China and the Soviet Union. Because if you're driven by a model in which, well, for example, an order went out from the Bolshevik, Russian, communist police, FBI, but it's actually their secret police. It said that we don't judge people on their individual merits. We judge them by their class. If you are a kulak, you're a criminal. People got 8 years, 10 years in the Gulag, concentration camps, just for owning a little farm. Because the idea was private property is bad. To make the world a holy place, to make the world socially just, we have to take away private property. And of course, there's resistance, because people don't want to be forced into this mold. And you see, you see the violence at Berkeley, where I didn't get to speak because of it. And these are people who are so enraged by what they see as the injustice of the system that they're willing to maim people and destroy things to get their way. And all the nightmare movements of the 20th century, the Nazis, it was the same thing. They were National Socialists. See, if we get rid of the Jews and the mongrel races, we'll make the world a better place. It's a very, very dangerous ideology, the social justice. You have to understand, it's the social part of the justice. We want justice. We want our judges to carry out justice in their courtrooms. We want people to be just. But if it's a program, then you're going to have to resort to force to do it. I have a magazine on the web called frontpagemagazine.com. And the motto, which is mine, is inside every progressive is a totalitarian screaming to get out. Take something as simple as Obamacare. Now, what I see wrong with Obamacare is that it takes away your individual freedom to manage your health. The government is going to step in. The government is going to take away your doctor, take away your plan, tell you what kind of health care package you can have, give you 4 choices. And eventually will tell you when you can die. You guys are young enough to think you're going to live forever. I remember that feeling. When you get to a certain age, there are several people in this room, I'm one of them, I'm alive because of I had access to medicine. I would have been dead 15 years ago if it weren't for modern medicine. So what happens when the government starts rationing that? Because there's always scarcity.
The civil rights movement.
Yeah, I actually remembered that. So I just, the reason inside every progressive is a totalitarian is because they think they're doing it for your own good. So why did Obama lie and say you can keep your doctor if you like him, period? He said it like 20 times. If you like your plan, you can keep it, period. Because he knew. And we know he knew because this architect, Jonathan Gruber, is on videotape saying it that way, deliberately lied because they knew that people would not accept the plan if they knew they were going to lose their doctor and their plan. They wouldn't have accepted Obamacare. And this Jonathan Gruber, who architected the plan, said, well, we did it for their own good. I have no regrets about lying to people. People are stupid, and this is in their own interest. And that's always the way they do it. I mean, Lenin didn't come to power in Russia saying, oh, let's kill 40 million people and enslave another 100 million. He said, we're going to bring bread, land, and peace. That was the slogan. The Communist Party, my parents were communists. And the slogan at the time, this is when Stalin, the great mass murderer, was running the Soviet Union, the Communist Party slogan was peace, jobs, and democracy. So it's very dangerous. It's the global idea. It's the idea that you can remake society, and in order to do that, you have to remake people. That's the dangerous idea. And that's what do you see on the left today? You see a movement to shut down people who disagree with them. The violence in Berkeley, which the police in Berkeley, they just stand and watch it because they're also progressives. It's to shut down the other sides, to end democracy. Because they don't want the opposition because their scheme is so grand. Let me put it this way, the more beautiful the idea, and it's a beautiful idea that we'll have a world that's perfectly, everybody's equal, everybody's taken care of, it's completely just. The more beautiful the dream, the greater the crimes that you will support to achieve that dream. If you thought that you could eliminate from the world war, poverty, prejudice, inequality, what crime would you not either commit or support? And what lie would you not tell to achieve that? That's very human. Now, the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was revolutionary, and we have had the greatest civil rights revolution in the history of the world. In the last, it's really in a generation, since the 60s. There's never been anything like it. You people are too young to be struck by the fact that you have, well, let me put it this way. In 1958, only 4% of Americans approved of interracial marriages between blacks and whites. 4%. Today, the figure is like 87%. So there's, as for the 13%, there's probably 13% of Americans who think that the moon is made of green cheese or something. Or that Elvis is alive on the moon. I mean, that's more likely. We have giant corporations that don't want to lose one customer, have black and white couples, and not just black males and white females. During the age of racism, this was the most taboo relationship, as it were. The Civil Rights Movement was revolutionary, but it was very conservative in its ideology. I'm talking about Martin Luther King. I'm not talking about race hustlers like Sharpton and Jackson, extortionists, people I have no respect for. But Martin Luther King, what was his vision? His vision was the vision of the founding, very conservative. The founders believed that despite our differences, despite people's prejudices, stated in our birth certificate that everyone was created equal in the eyes of their creator, and therefore government had to treat them equally. Not an easy thing to accomplish. It took us a very long time to accomplish that. But that was the idea and the dream. And that's Martin Luther King's dream. Very American, very conservative. I hope that answers your question. I'd like to see another young person.
Young person over
Here's one. What? Okay, why don't you recognize people? Go ahead.
here.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Horowitz. I was actually looking at your Twitter page, and you've had a lot of condemnation from Republicans, saying that they have certain problems with condemning those on the left. And you also align yourself with Milo Yiannopoulos, who is someone that is outwardly anti-feminist, anti-trans, and also aligns himself with alt-right. Politically, where do you stand? Are you also aligning yourself with alt-right? And if not, what is your problem?
These are grand abstractions. I don't know. I have a trans grandchild myself. I have a very open attitude. Donald Trump said at the National Convention of Republicans, we have to defend the LGBTQ community. I think Milo is a really good person. And I think that his attacks on feminism, if you look at the YouTubes of him confronting feminists, you'll see it's not an attack on women, it's an attack on radical ideologues. And when you go to university, I don't know I hope you're not taught this in this school. When you go to university, you'll be taught that gender is a social construction. The idea again there is that everybody is equal, as in the same, which we're not. Women, the female gender is very different from the male gender, and there are lots of gradations, if you will.
Sorry, excuse me. My question wasn't if you align yourself. My question was simply to distinguish yourself politically.
I don't know anybody who's alt-right. I don't even know what it means. I mean, there is a guy, this jerk, Richard Spencer, who's a neo-Nazi that the liberal press likes to make into a big figure. I don't see that he has any following. I've never met I know there are some white nationalists. There are also plenty of black racists. So what?
Oh, no, my problem.
Yeah, you shouldn't believe everything you read about me on the internet. Distancing myself. Yeah, I don't agree with all Republicans.
Yeah, I just wanted clarification on.
No, I think we should all think as individuals. To me, I mean, if I've said anything today, it's the specifics that matter. You look at the details. You look at the individual and hold the individual accountable. You have these, feminism, genders, races, that obliterates people. They're abstractions. The left loves to deal in abstractions. I try not to. I mean, you have to. It's a way we communicate. But I think it has great risks if you get too abstract.
Maybe time for one more question. One more question.
Yeah, let me give you an example. I was attacked by Senator Blumenthal, who was really attacking Jeff Sessions in his confirmation hearings. And he wanted to portray Jeff Sessions, who was a champion of civil rights in Alabama, as a racist. So he said, I had given an award to Jeff Sessions, and to show that I was a racist, he quoted me saying that there are too many black people in prison because too many blacks commit crimes. That's a comment. Now, how do we know that the blacks in prison aren't there unjustly. Well, the FBI hasn't, first of all, we know that 95% of the victims of black crimes are blacks. And then the FBI has an annual crime victims report where they interview the victims. So to think that a black criminal is in jail because actually a white criminal committed a rape or a robbery, you would have to think that the black person who was the victim, who knew that the perpetrator was white, was saying that they were black, which is ridiculous. So it's a problem, and I'm, as a conservative, I believe a large part of the problem is the destruction of the black family in our inner cities by liberal democratic welfare policies. That's my view.
So, are you trying to say that any left-wing movement that is hoping to inspire change is ultimately trying to rebuild the world as some perfect utopia?
Yeah. So I've been there. Until I was 35, I was one of them.
I ask because it's that right there is a very black and white approach to it. You were condemning that sort of approach to
Well-
seeing things in black and white.
Well, no, because it's an ideology. I'm describing an ideology. Do I think that there are plenty of people who are on these demonstrations who are there to meet other people and have fun? Sure. Everybody isn't an ideologue, but the ideology is there. How do you explain, like the Women's March? The Women's March, the chairwoman of the Women's March is a Hamas-supporting terrorist, Linda Sarsour, who believes that Islamic law should be instituted across the United States, which would take away the rights of women, the rights of gays, the rights of all infidels. How do you explain that another leader of the Women's March is Rasmia Oda, who blew up a supermarket? She's a convicted terrorist who was freed in a prisoner exchange and has just been deported from the United States for committing fraud to get into the country. And there's another woman named Hilton, who's also at the top of the Women's March, who was part of a gang that raped and murdered, tortured, and held for ransom and then murdered a gay man 27 years ago. This isn't about, it would take us a lot longer to explain why this is the case, but it's not a march for women. It's a leftist march to destroy the capitalist system, our democracy, and create a perfect world. We done?
We're going to have to dismiss, but here's what I'd like to invite.
Thanks for coming.
There are some students who might like to remain and talk with
Sure.
you for a while.
I'll hang around.
I'd like to provide that opportunity. I talked with Mrs. Harrington. If there are some students who would like to talk with Mr. Horowitz, feel free. We'd like to thank everybody for coming this morning, especially our guests to Pancakes of Providence. God bless.